Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Edd Norval. How's it going, mate? Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it. Big fan of the Twitter or the X account.
No, I appreciate that, man. Thanks very much. Big fan of your work as well, which is part of the reason that we've got you on today. It's going to be more of a thematic discussion today, is one of the ways that you could put it. We are going to be talking about football and identity and how that marries in with heritage, brand, image, marketing, and all those kind of things. Now, I know what you're thinking, but just to clarify, we haven't turned into a marketing podcast. This is something that is quite important for football clubs today. And it's something that has always been prevalent within football clubs, particularly the way that they portray themselves through their kit colours, their badges, the types of words and phrases that they use. And it's something that Edd actually does full-time as a job, is basically digging into the heritage of these clubs to find ways that they can improve their image, tap into their heritage, and try and really reach their supporters' base and strengthen their roots within their communities. So, Edd, just before we kick things off, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and I suppose the in-depths of the work that you do?
Yeah, so I started out my career, so I'm from Edinburgh, as you can probably tell with the accent. Started off my career working in advertising. I'd done a Masters in Creative Advertising. Started off at Leith Agency in Edinburgh, which was like a dream job. It was all I wanted from my degree. I got there. And then very quickly, just for like several sort of like personal reasons, and the time was just wrong. So I ended up sort of heading off to Lisbon. I'd never been. I just thought, yeah, pack my bags and find somewhere new. Went to Lisbon and started working in art quite a lot. So I was working with a street artist called Revolves. He's one of the better known in the world. Was working there. Worked at Fuel TV, so that was almost more like an extreme sports, so like surfing, skateboarding, that kind of thing, but very much in content and creative on both of those sides. So it was still advertising, but probably more on the creative expression side. I think a lot of people in advertising have found, and this is not for Leith Agency, this was a general observation, people like a copywriter feel like they're frustrated writers who maybe want to be writing a novel but aren't. Art directors feel like they should just be artists, but they're kind of like settling with the agency life. And it felt like the environment was almost, or generally agency environments, they felt at times stifled. I think that's less true now. I think agencies, obviously, there's peaks and troughs in how the advertising industry goes. And I think now agencies, again, are starting to lean into like, look, let's just go all out creative. I think for a time when the internet was sort of starting to grow, social media growing, there was a identity crisis, I suppose. But yeah, that was why I sort of moved on from the advertising industry quickly, although I still had one foot in there. And then I ended up in Denmark. What I was doing there was another Masters in Heritage Management. And that's probably what put me onto this path. I had written about football for years, for these Football Times, for the Blizzard, various other publications. When I went into heritage management, I actually wanted to do the physical side. So that was looking after heritage things, be that buildings or be that artefacts. But very quickly, I understood about the intangible side of heritage. And football's somewhere in the middle. You know, there's obviously tangible aspects, even a kit or memorabilia or things, stadium, of course, and intangible, like rituals, place in society, stuff like that. So I decided to do my thesis on the use of heritage in marketing for football clubs. And what happened then was every club I spoke to, bar none, and I had to speak to quite a lot, said that we would love to explore our identity, love to sort of lean into our heritage and build from that, but we don't have the resources. That would be time resources, human resources, and that could be through expertise and just having enough people. Football is a very fast-moving industry. It's all about the next match. Very, very few clubs are actually able to step back or have anyone in a role that can step back and look at the sort of overarching development of something like an identity. So seeing that gap in the market, once I graduated, I got together with a couple of guys that I'm close with, and we said, let's just, make an agency that basically is like an extension to football clubs. We would be brought in to do exactly what the football clubs don't have the resources to do. We quickly discovered that clubs will say they want that. And then when it comes to paying for that, it's a different thing, right? So we've spent the last couple of years as the Deep doing various things within football and a little bit in other sport. But it's only probably been the last month that we've actually really sort of recentered to what our initial mission was. At the start, we've just been kind of developing a body of work so we could, I suppose, prove the value of identity and heritage because it's a commercial game. And now we're in a position where the Deep, the agency that I co-founded, we can prove that value. And we've just sort of recently rebuilt our offering to focus on that one thing, which is coming into a club, understanding who you are, what you're about, and how that manifests through various forms of identity. And that could be everything from merchandise to season ticket campaigns, kit design, everything like that.
That's brilliant. I mean, there's a few things in there that I picked up on, but, you know, as our listeners will know, if you've been a long-time listener of the show, Ed is very much speaking my language here, and he echoes a lot of the sentiments that I've put out in other episodes. You know, the ritualistic nature of football. One of the things that I've said so many times in this show is that as football supporters, I don't think we realise that for at least 2 hours once a week, we go up the same streets, take the same modes of transport to go to the same place, to sing the same songs with the same people, visit the same pubs, the same restaurants. And within that, there's so many different aspects of heritage, place being probably the strongest. But you're right, it's absolutely ritualistic. And I suppose what helped you, when you done your heritage management degree was that you already had that background in sort of advertising and marketing, where you realised that there was a really, really strong niche here, and that clubs could actually be tapping into their heritage resources and the history of their clubs to promote themselves, basically. But then, like you said, with when you set up the Deep with your company, there is obviously a commercial gain to it, and you need to be justifying to these clubs why they're going to benefit from this, because at the end of the day, they want to see a kind of tangible number as to how this is positively impacting them. So I can imagine that trying to track that must be a bit difficult too. And I'd be quite interested to see that myself, but maybe that's a conversation for another time. But everything that you said there is absolutely spot on, and you really have found your niche. I can imagine it's been really, really fascinating, some of the research and the work that you've done with different football clubs.
It's been amazing. I think it's one of those things where when it's something you're passionate about and it's your love anyway, it doesn't feel like you're working. And sometimes in many ways you have to pinch yourself and realise, look, this is my job. But I suppose on the flip side also, you see sides of football clubs that you maybe thought, okay, I wish I retained my rose-coloured glasses a little bit more. So I suppose you'll probably find during this podcast, some of the language used now probably sounds more commercially driven than I would speak if I was maybe in the pub speaking to mates about it. But the reason for that is it's just, I suppose, we've almost sharpened our vocabulary around our target audience, and for things like what we do to actually work or happen in a football club, you have to understand who your target audience are, and that would be an owner, a chairman, a CEO, or heads of departments. And ultimately, what defines your working relationship with them or how you help them reach their goals. And a lot of that comes down to, two things. One thing, commercial growth. But that can be sort of arrived at via fan engagement is one thing. And that goes from buying shirts to putting bums on seats via season tickets, memberships, things like that. And I suppose, to be honest, that's probably the limitation actually. Fan engagement is probably the best way in. And I think that keeps things, when we look at that way, it keeps it sounding sort of less cynical, which sometimes it can feel cynical working in football. But that's just, again, understanding that, look, it's a business. And clubs, rightly or wrongly, operate as businesses when, they're not quite businesses. Although they are, there certainly sits somewhere, sometimes uncomfortably, between a museum and a business, a heritage institution and a performance-led business like any other. So,
yeah, you're spot on. I think that's something you said on Twitter recently as well, and that's why I got in touch, was because football clubs effectively sit somewhere between these cultural institutions and sports organisations, and all the other things you just mentioned there, having to be a business which stays afloat, if anything, but also being something that is ultimately representative of a very large and diverse group of people. So, you've got a huge amount of elements in there. And as you've touched on as well, it is often a question of resource, why clubs end up doing this. And I suppose, from my perspective, maybe to play devil's advocate a little bit, some might say, well, why are clubs looking at a creative agency as opposed to, historians or heritage researchers? And what I would say to that is that for Scotland anyway, and it's maybe the case for England as well, there is only one club which has an in-house heritage department which is actually given any money by their football club, and that's Hearts. And I mean, in some ways you can probably see the benefits of them doing that. Hearts are incredibly entrenched in their community. They've done that by building it up over the last couple of decades or so. But they're the only ones that are doing it. And I suppose the sort of average football fan's experience of club-led heritage is within clothing ranges or maybe the odd Legends match. It's all consumer-based and it's all based on then turning a profit. And, again, that's a bit of a conversation for another time, but I suppose it goes some way to explaining why football clubs don't normally actively engage with the sort of voluntary-led or academic heritage side of things. So we'll maybe come and touch on that a little bit later on. But one thing that I wanted to ask you first of all, and it's probably the question that sets up the majority of this episode, why is it important for football clubs to have a strong identity?
Yeah, so this is probably when some of these things can sound quite, answers can sound quite commercially orientated, but I think I would caveat by saying that probably is important, because I think if you want to do good work in this space, that is the language you have to speak. And I think your actions sort of are obviously an extension of the language that you use, right? So for me, I think to answer that question, the importance for football clubs to have a strong identity really comes down to securing what I see as a long term. And I'm talking, if you get this identity right, this should be something that ultimately activated in different ways but remains largely unchanged for 20, 25 years. And of course, obviously, social conditions, etc. might impact maybe how you position your club. But for me, it's about securing that long-term competitive advantage within a football landscape that is constantly evolving and constantly changing. I think it's easy to be beholden to trends. It's easy to sort of give in to trends. But identity isn't trends, and they very rarely manifest as trends. It's something that goes far deeper than that. Football is now increasingly commodified, and fan expectations, certainly around what their club put out, so digital engagement and things like that, it's constantly changing. So a strong and distinctive identity, both global and local, are absolutely essential for clubs in order to make sure that they create things that resonate with their target audience, which is their fans. And I think something that we do at The Deep, we look at sort of going beyond what would be like traditional kind of orthodox branding strategies, very like bread and butter marketing. And we try and sort of reframe, I think, two important things. And these are things that 2 years ago, I would hate myself for saying. But one is a football club's a brand, period. Your brand is ultimately what makes you distinctive and differentiated. And I don't think that would be too much of a stretch for a lot of football fans to nod in agreement with. The other one, and I think why it's very important to sort of reframe thinking around identity in these terms, is for me, I think fans should be seen as and treated as customers first and foremost, and that's going to make a lot of people think, mate, come on now. But I think the thing is, it's because football clubs misunderstand loyalty. They think that loyalty means, I'm a Hibs fan, okay, so and that will probably come out late in the conversation anyway. And by the way, I totally agree with Hearts. I think Hearts are absolutely brilliant at what they've done. But if I'm a Hibs fan, and this is purely hypothetical in this context, but if I'm a Hibs fan, okay, so if Hibs aren't doing things that I like, I won't then go and become a Hearts fan or a Spartans fan or whatever. But I might not be an active fan. I might then become a passive fan. And that still is, I guess, a fundamental misunderstanding of loyalty, is that, okay, Ed, one of our fans, and of whom there are many for Hibs and Hearts, he's not going to become a fan of that rival club, sure, but he may as well be if he's not coming to games, if he's not buying merchandise, if he's not engaging with what we do online. Whereas that is ultimately comes down to clubs seeing fans as fans, loyal fans, period. But customers for brands are people that you fight for, that you constantly reshape your product for, that you listen to, good brands anyway, that you're ultimately a reflection of, because you're going into the market and you're giving people what they want, what they need. And I think that's a key thing that we look at the deep and that we speak to with clubs about. If you have that identity right, that's your brand. And then the next step from there is, okay, we're a brand now. Who's our customers? That's our fans. Okay, how do we fight for these fans? How do we keep these fans as engaged fans? And not just assume that loyalty means that just because I won't support another team means I am an active fan. Because the majority of fans, you look at the email list for any football club, you're probably getting, it depends on the club. If you're Manchester United, you're getting a minuscule percentage of that actually attending games, of course. Slightly larger, maybe wearing merchandise and stuff, because they've obviously got that global fan base. With Hibs, you've probably got 10% go to games. So it's how do we get these sort of passive fans to become active fans? And I think that is what your identity does. It's that way to say, look, this is who we are, what we're about. Here are our values. Here's how our values manifest. Engage with us. And I think that's a key thing. And I think that's what, with the deep, we come into clubs to do that. It's not just a rebrand. It's ultimately about defining and redefining the club's place in the modern football landscape. And to do that, I think what differentiates us from, say, a traditional marketing agency as well, and this is not to sell us, this is a larger sort of perspective on this, because I would urge every football club to bring people in, as you said, maybe not a historian and stuff, but definitely people who understand heritage. I think it's mandatory, and I think that ideally a creative director will become just commonplace in football clubs within 5-10 years, just like sporting directors were, maybe 10 years ago started to be introduced, certainly to British football. It's that we think of things in a sort of culture-led strategic approach, and we think of things long-term. And that's two things that I just don't think football clubs do. And again, I think an identity requires both of those things. An identity requires long-term thinking, and it requires you to understand the culture around the club intimately.
I totally agree. And just to come back to what you said at the end there, it's like what you said earlier on, whereas jumping on the latest trends, whether that be for branding, marketing or social media, jumping on those things in the short term, people always view as being more beneficial than investing in something like identity and heritage, which is much more long term, as you'll know from the work that you do. But the benefits of doing it long term can be far more significant. And again, it all comes back to this question of not taking your loyal fans for granted. And it's like, just because, you're a Hibs fan doesn't mean you're going to support someone else, but it also doesn't mean that you are, kind of nailed on to always be there for the club, because, as fans, we go through peaks and troughs, and that happens. We know it happens. But clubs don't always look at that. So, at first when you said clubs should treat fans as customers, I was like, oh, wait a minute. But the way you've explained it there is that they kind of effectively do, because otherwise they'll then take fans for granted. So by treating them as customers, they then realise their value a little bit more. So it is a bit of a roundabout way of going about it, but you've justified that perfectly. And I agree with you in that sense that by doing this, then clubs might actually understand the value that their fans can bring to the table by, I suppose maybe rewarding their loyalty is maybe a strange way to put it, but effectively that's what it is, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think you can it's very rarely that any club, I think, doesn't take their fans for granted, because, to watch my language, the stuff that they put out is very much substandard. Merchandise that just 100% polyester, made in China, just thoughtless stuff. We make it, they'll consume it. That, to me, feels like the approach that I would say a vast majority of clubs, 9 out of 10, take. Social media content, announcing new player signings with like the office gif or betweeners edits that say nothing about who you are. And yes, okay, in the short term, well done, man. You've got 10,000 likes. That's fantastic. So I get the commercial case. You can maybe say when you're showing, your deck to potential partners, we got this much engagement. But again, that's up to the potential sponsors and partners to think, okay, but how did they come to these figures? What's the average likes, for example? Right, that's the difference. Okay, so if you're a sponsor, if you're a front of shirt partner, you want to get your name in front of as many people as possible who are engaged with the club. Otherwise, they just don't give a shit. Like, they're just not going to care or buy into anything. So if you can see these sort of, well, always inflated social media numbers or engagement figures, but it's really up to brands to dig deeper and think, okay, but yeah, what's the average engagement? What are the comments like? What's the fan sentiment like? They're the clubs we should target. And again, that's coming up from a different side. That's more brands coming into clubs, but nonetheless, clubs should cater for this. And they should think, okay, if we build something longer term, resilient, regardless of results, because that's something that, it's not on my side of things anyway, plus sort of identity and cultural model that, yeah, regardless of results, fans still buy into what you do way above and beyond the results on the pitch. And I think that's something that yes, it's not short-term gains, but again, yeah, if you look at sort of average engagement with posts, that's how a strong identity manifests. And you do see that, there are, I would say, it's not happening too quickly, but more and more clubs are starting to cotton on to that and realise, right, okay, it's not just about getting as many likes and going viral, man, being shared by like football banter pages and stuff. It's just meaningless vanity metrics. It's about creating content that your fans actively engage with. I mean, look over at the US, you look at like college football, as in American football, they're creating stuff that their fans just go mad over because they're like their entertainment / media houses almost. But this is what fans want. They're engaged fans, and that's good. I know a lot of people almost have an inherent kind of revulsion towards American models of doing stuff, but they get it, man. They know how to do business, and I think they know fan engagement better than any other country on earth. And I think you look at the content that they put out, the average likes and stuff is just crazy, man. And look, funnily enough, they're getting 90,000 people to games. They're selling a crazy number of shirts. They're doing huge commercial deals. That's because they're engaging with their fans. They have this audience that want more of this. And if their club does it, they'll buy into it because they align with identity, because they align with those values. And that's what you want to build, that deep relationship between club and fan.
Spot on. Vanity metrics is a really good way of putting it as well. It's like, what's the point if you get 20,000 likes on a signing post if you're only going to be getting 100 on every other post you put out that's actually to do with the club? Just because you put like a funny gif up or whatever, it totally makes sense as well. And it's about building, as you said, the bridge between fan and club that strengthens that relationship and actually makes people want to engage with you and see you not just as a brand or a football club, but also as their community. Do you know what I mean? And something that they feel represented by enough so that they're actively engaging with you and, they actually kind of look forward to the content that you're putting out there as well. So, I mean, we've kind of touched on it a little bit already with the football clubs and their identities. Just to explain to some of our listeners who might not know too much about branding and marketing, how do these things all come hand in hand? So how does identity mix with brand and marketing, and how are football clubs actually able to harness this to strengthen their identities?
Yeah, so I suppose the graphic that we often use in our decks, and I posted it like on social media a lot, it's a pyramid, a triangle with identity at the top. So there was a quote from, it was like Roy Disney, Walt Disney's brother or something, who took over at Disney. But he said, once you get your values right, everything else falls into place. The same is applied to identity. Identity sits at the top of the pyramid, and then everything else comes from your identity. So your brand is your identity. So that's one thing it would be worth saying is like, they're not really different things. It's just brand identity, you could call it. It's just brand identity sounds very marketing. Yeah. Whereas identity sounds like it's a little bit more relatable within the context of football, but they're one and off the same. So brand identity is at the top, and then how that manifests, a part of that is marketing. Obviously, other parts can be, I mean, look, clubs that get it right, they'll manifest this on the pitch too. The clubs that, I guess we can chat about this later, but clubs that get it right, they make sure that their identity extends to the football side. And actually, they will bring in managers who reflect that identity. So that identity, really, if you do it right, it should be all-encompassing. But for the purpose of this, we can kind of keep it to off the field. So to get to that stage, to understand an identity, basically what we do is we do a deep audit into the club's sort of like culture and motifs, fan behaviours, fan wants. That will be qualitative and quantitative. We speak to fans, that's the most important thing. And that's the beautiful thing about football. Unlike any other brand, really, or any other sector, just ask. It's not some kind of mad dark arts that how do you elicit this information from people? Just ask, or just go on social media and look. fans will share because they want what's best for the club, because it means that much to them, and that's a beautiful thing that should be celebrated. So speak to fans, sit down with them. At Carnarvon Town recently, so we are, as the Deep, officially creative directors of Carnarvon Town, who recently just got into Europe for the first time, who are in the top division of Welsh football. We had a fan engagement session, and we try to speak to fans everywhere that we can, because that's who you're doing this for, right? Let's be real, And one thing they said was, we would love a football shirt related to Owen Glendower. Owen Glendower was a sort of famous historical figure who, and this is not in any way anti-English, he fought against the English forces in 1401 in Carnarvon on a battle on a hill in Carnarvon. So he's a figure that fans sort of relate to more in the sense of his Welshness, not the sense of that Englishness, because sure. That fans have a spectrum of sort of social and political opinions. But the fans says this is what we want, right? I think initially there was maybe some reservations within the club about, okay, is this going to be seen as maybe controversial? Is it maybe poking the bear? But ultimately, that's what fans wanted. And I don't think that's to say absolutely every single time a fan wants something, you have to do what they say. Of course not. But I think when fans are saying this, when this could be an interesting subject to broader conversation, which is, again, football can be a great platform for these kind of conversations, politically, socially, culturally, etc. We thought, let's make the shirt, right? So we created a sort of off-white and gold shirt, 1401 on the back, and that was based on the famous Glendower flag, which was the first time that the Welsh Dragon was seen. This flag was white with yellow. We didn't want to do those colours, just didn't look good, so we done a sort of off-white and a gold. And we launched it sort of telling the story of the shirt, and it was a best-selling away shirt of all time. It sold out. And that got us a lot of sort of inbound inquiries, a lot of people asking, how did you do it? And the answer is simple. We listened to the fans. It's not difficult. Yes, we brought it to life in a way that was creative, and we put a lot of thought into how it was marketed. Released it at like 2 minutes, so it was 1401 on the, little things like that, little Easter eggs we thought we had fun with. It was, things that a lot of people won't notice, but we thought, yeah, this is good, and fans are just delighted with it, and that's what matters. So I think that's where the marketing side comes from. I think it's just understanding, okay, you've got your identity, how do you bring this to life? What are the different touch points that fans engage with? What are the current trends, right? Because there are still trends, i.e. maybe not just using what show's in at the moment and then doing a matchday poster based on that show. Okay, that might work, it might not. But obviously some trends are still relevant. Okay, so there's a switch towards using TikTok being a sort of increasingly popular platform in football. But that's good because football clubs are having a problem with engaging younger fans. Yeah. So that's an issue that every club wants to have younger fans, and they should, because these are fans that grow into being older fans, right? And these, hopefully, they stay with you for the rest of your life. So you need to still understand who you're speaking to, and target markets or target audiences always evolve, always change. Demographics is probably a better way to say that. And what worked for a younger audience 10 years ago certainly won't really work now. Principles maybe, but in terms of practical applications, definitely not. With TikTok, for sure. So again, that's the marketing side that I think is absolutely necessary to bring identity to life, because you need to understand the various touch points, and you need to understand the sort of best practices and best routes to these demographics. And I think there's also just various sort of skills that you develop within marketing, i.e. understanding messaging, clarity of messaging, your audience, that I think is absolutely essential to bring that to life too.
Yeah, it's like, there's a few things that, again, it's like one practice makes perfect, by working in marketing and working in branding, you understand what works, and you do develop your own brand as an individual as well, and how your typeface is, etc. But also for the club side and your side as well, it's about being proactive as opposed to reactive. And sometimes you do need to be reactive. It's not just as black and white as one or the other. But if you're constantly being reactive, then you're never going to be able to grow, because you're always going to be constantly changing and constantly fluid. And yes, as you mentioned, football is a fast moving industry, but one of the things that you can't seem to be constantly changing is your identity, even if it's just small tweaks, or the way that you speak with and engage with your fans, which is why being proactive is the best way forward. And when you mentioned younger fans there as well, it just popped into my head, like, obviously within the lower leagues in Scotland, there's been quite an upward trend of younger fans attending games, but some of them have come under fire for, bringing pyro, or there maybe been a bit of antisocial behaviour, which is, again, a completely different issue, and it's totally understandable. But there was a period of time where, like, a group of young fans would turn up for one game, they'd cause a bit of noise, and then the club would release a statement basically telling them to shut up and don't cause a ruckus. Whereas Peterhead, for instance, actually built their young ultras group like a shed out of a shipping container, basically, and nurtured that culture. And I don't think people realise how much that will actually benefit them in the long run, that they gave a young group of supporters a home. Do you know what I mean? And though it's not marketing per se, it was a very, very shrewd move and a very, very clever way to actually build their brand by doing that. There's a whole bunch of different things that football clubs can actually do to tap into that,
Mate, I think the proactive reactive is a major important point in football, because you're constantly reacting to results, to player behaviours and actions that, football clubs very rarely do take a proactive approach to who they are. Because I guess, there's various reasons. There's high turnover of staff, it's very fast paced, there are goals that you have to meet. But I think exactly embracing younger fans in the way that, your example there, I know Spartans have got quite a,
Spartans are one of my favourites. Yeah,
man, great. And let's be real, they're just absolutely superb.
They are.
To my understanding, I don't want to say everything because I don't know, but everything I see, Spartans seem to be very good at. That's no coincidence, that's just strategic thinking, right? But yeah, you're right. I think being proactive, those fans being embraced, that is proactive in the sense that what you're saying there is, okay, we believe these younger people's expressions are valid. We believe that their voice is valid, and we want to make them feel at home just like everyone else, because we accept that fandom changes. You had the casual culture in the 80s and 90s, even noughties. Now it's more of a sort of European model of ultras. And I know a lot of people will take the piss out of the younger fans, but I think it's absolutely class, mate. I think they, with their drums and their pyro and everything, how can you not embrace that? Is it funny? Sometimes it can be, of course, but mate, it's brilliant. It adds to the atmosphere, absolutely. And I think it's just very dangerous for clubs to sort of turn a blind eye to that. I think it is something to be nourished. When I lived in Lisbon, for 3 years I was there at the sporting games. It was basically a part of the stadium, almost like an underground car park, but each of the different major ultras groups had their own almost like cavernous bar area. And everyone's sitting there like smoking, drinking. So you can't smoke inside, right? But everyone's just like tanning fags and having a beer. And the club just obviously just turn a blind eye, because why wouldn't you? And I understand, okay, in the UK people are very, very beholden to every rule. Has to be by the book, and it's just a brutal way to live sometimes. But in Portugal, they're not really like that. There's much more of a sort of je ne sais quoi about life, and it just is what it is. And the club have lent into that. Thus, they have an extremely engaged fan base that buy into what they do, that live and breathe the club, and not just the football club, man, but the kickboxing team, the basketball, the netball or volleyball, whatever it is else that they had. And that's identity, that's brand, because it's not just the football they're buying into, it's the thing itself.
Yeah, you're spot on. I visited Lisbon for the first time in July, and I actually done the sporting museum tour. It's a hell of an impressive trophy room they've got, and again, it's not just their football trophies, though. It's every single trophy that they have ever won across all of their sporting divisions. And you're right, that's what brand is. It's kind of like, ultras will back the idea as opposed to backing the specific 11 players that are on the field. That's kind of almost like a byproduct, and that comes after the fact. But it's the idea, the values, and the identity that they're actually backing and that they're expressing themselves, which again is a nice little nuance that I think is often missed in football. But it comes on nicely to the next sort of question that I wanted to bring up, is that you have sport in there who fall into this category, but I suppose clubs like Athletic Bilbao, Exeter City, ones that are up and coming, I suppose my own club, Celtic, as well. These are all clubs with really, really strong identities, and there's a whole host of other clubs out there as well. Roma, Lazio, Inter, Napoli, and they've all got different things going on for them. I suppose these are all really, really obvious examples, but have you ever worked with clubs who are maybe trying to establish an identity or have struggled, and it's maybe not as obvious as, for obviously those clubs, they have different socioeconomic and political reasons behind their identities perhaps. Have you ever worked with any clubs where it's been a bit more difficult for them to actually tap into that history and really bring their identity out?
Yeah, so just very quickly on ultras, by the way, as well, I think you made a great point that the ultras actually do provide like a check and balance because they're not necessarily enamoured with the 11 players on the pitch, or more importantly, I think the people who are high up in the club. It's the club, the brand. That's what they love. So these are guys and girls who will not let clubs just get away with things if they're not acting within the club's best interests. And I wish a lot more clubs had that kind of check and balance system somewhere built in, because absolutely people who hold C-suite positions in clubs care about their next job, and they act in a way that has they don't think the long term, because why would you? They'll not be there. They're not going to plant any seeds of trees that they can't sit under, right? They care about the here and now because that will get them their next job, and they want a cushy number. That's why football clubs should have people like creative directors, heads of brand, heritage, and history people. There should be a department in some way that looks after the brand, period. So that sort of leading on to the next point, who does it well? It's clubs that understand their brand. For me, the best, I think, in the world, because it's probably the most intentional in the world, well, there's two. If you go back a few years, I would say Venezia.
Yeah,
I think Venezia, I know that this is a very typical example. Whenever we work with a club, they'll say, I want to be like Venezia. It's like, right, but Venezia, because they're like Venezia and they understand Venetian people and they understand Venice. They understand the culture, the motifs, the iconography, the symbolism, the behaviours. You need to understand what makes you unique, and that's what your identity is, right? It's your unique selling point, ultimately. So I think when you look at clubs that do it well, Venezia were definitely one because of who they had at the helm. They had Ted, I can't remember his surname, he's Greek, but now he's at Athens Calathea, and he's done something very similar there.
it has, the kits, that's where the link comes in.
By the way, also they got promoted, right? And so did Venezia. So like under his time there or just after. So that's the thing, right? They come hand in hand. Like Venezia have exploded. They're a commercial powerhouse in comparison to what they were. They were in debt, mate. Drake got them out of debt, which is mad. But yeah, they're a club that they get who they are. They understand their identity. That did manifest as shirts, and that's what made people fall in love with them. I get it because they were beautiful shirts, but it went way beyond that. They had a very, very engaged sort of fan base and culture that came from listening, that came from Ted asking the key question of who are we and what do we stand for? Listen to the people. I wondered what would happen when he left. I know things are maybe slightly more sort of, say, commercially driven there now, but I did notice a front of shirt sponsor this year is actually like a spritz kind of drink from Venice, which I thought was quite nice. I always do think that if you can give your front of shirt or a sort of marquee sponsorship to something that represents similar values and or has tie to place, it's another way of sort of introducing your brand to a wider audience. But yeah, the other example, man, I would say is Royal Anderlecht. Anderlecht have been getting a lot of flowers online for their beautiful social media graphics. I had the privilege to sit and speak to one of their senior members recently, and I wanted to know what they do, how they do it. Although I had a strong indication, I thought, I wonder, am I seeing things how I imagine they'll be, or am I coming from it just in a totally uneducated perspective? And it did reinforce what I thought, and that's not because I'm some kind of genius, it's because it's very smart. You hire people who understand the value of brand, and you listen to people and you identify the key values, and then you build on them in a creative way. So they are about 5 years in the making for the sort of team that they have together just now. They came across sort of early, roadblocks because they had to hit those sort of short-term quick wins before they got larger buy-in. But they did get that buy-in eventually because they had basically, right, so they're very interested in that their sort of organisational structure, they don't really have departments, and that some clubs more traditionally would have, say, media, socials, comms, commercial, marketing, events. They have a commercial department, and then they have like a non-playing department. And ultimately, all of those people within that team are all marketers, and they all come from a brand background. So they all do a little bit of everything, a bit of socials, a bit of comms. They speak to the manager when they bring in a new manager. If we're trying to portray class, you can't be running up and down the sideline swearing. In interviews, you have to come across composed. It's very holistic in the way they do it. And if you look at, Royal Anderlecht, right, royal, okay, so purple, so rich, lush. Their shirts this year lean into sort of like Art Deco, sort of higher brow design. Whether that's what you associate with or not, that doesn't matter. It's for their fans, and that's what matters. St. Pauli, I suppose, would be another example. And again, you could definitely sort of take shots at them for how it's become quite commodified, but that's also largely probably beyond their control. And they have put that money into their playing side, and they have seen better results. So it's a net positive across the field. But there you have two very distinct examples of clubs with very distinct identities. Royal Anderlecht that have that more classy, refined appeal, and that manifests in every single touch point, to the language they use, to the type of social media graphics they post. They never post anything that's like trending, as it were. Ever. They don't do it. The results, great sales on home shirt, great sales on away. They had a waiting list now for season ticket holders. They've got like 10,000 plus paying subscribers to their OTT platform. St. Pauli, on the flip side, I don't know the sort of ins and outs with them as much, but they're a global brand. Again, manifests across various sort of touch points. You've got the tunnel that got redecorated, Welcome to Hell or something. It says, it's like mad, like glow in the dark, deep reds. It really ties into this feeling of like punky underground club, which ties into the area that they're from, and certainly ties into their sort of political and social embeddedness within society from probably the 80s mostly, 70s and 80s probably. Yes, they're a global brand, but the people who wear St. Pauli t-shirts, you know what they stand for, man. You know their values, right? You're not going to have a Lazio fan wearing a St. Pauli t-shirt, put it that way. And I think that, just like you're not going to have, the reverse would be true too. So that's what your brand identity is, and these are quite clear examples, I think, too. And you mentioned other ones. X are fantastic. Bristol City are pretty good. Charlton are pretty good now. Celtic, of course. I mean, Celtic are just one of those clubs that they're represented in almost every corner of the earth. You will see Celtic shirt. Almost as common, I feel, as United, City more now, Real Madrid and Barcelona, because almost every city has an Irish bar, and then pretty much every Irish bar is a Celtic top. And because of that, the diaspora sort of congregates around these areas, and Celticness bleeds outwards, and then you get supporters clubs everywhere. They've been very, very smart in their strategic moves towards the US, towards New York, certainly through their community foundation, and now with Asia, certainly Japan, because obviously the Japanese players, which more and more clubs are doing, leaning into where their players come from and using that as a sort of a Trojan horse to gain a foothold within new markets. But yeah, I think there's a lot of clubs that are great examples. Como now. Como has a very distinctive asset of a big, beautiful lake, and they've leaned into that with their shirt, the way they launched the shirt, their overall brand ties into, again, that sort of refined, classy Italian feeling. And again, that's no coincidence. People that are there are good at what they do. So yeah, I think there's a lot of examples, more and more. Athletic Bilbao are probably the best in the sense of they mean the most to the most amount of people in that place. I think that's just almost every kid grows up wanting to play for them from that area. And I think a lot of people around the world, clubs, are envious of the model they've built and the absolute, they're just inextricably linked.
Yeah.
The club and the people in the place.
Yeah, Bilbao are a great example as well. And you can almost pick apart these different elements and pick the best examples. St. Pauli are the best from a global brand perspective. Bilbao are the best for an identity perspective. And all their fans are 100% behind the club. And one of my favourite clubs from Scotland that really taps into it is Motherwell.
Yes.
Even just everything down to becoming fan-owned around Motherwell, obviously former Steel Town, there's always been this sense of collective ownership and collectivism more generally. And they've really been putting a lot of time and a lot of effort into exploring their heritage, but really putting down roots as a community club where new people coming into Motherwell as well are also made to feel welcome and almost brought into the football club from the off so that they can, kind of become citizens of Motherwell, so to speak. But one of the clubs, which is also from the same area, which often comes to my mind, in Caledonian Braves, and this isn't to slag them off or anything, but it's just, they changed their name from effectively what was a French sporting academy based in Scotland. That was its purpose. They play in an AstroTurf Park. It's not even really in Motherwell. It's next to Strathclyde Park. They don't really have much of an identity, if any. How would you go about a process of trying to build something that they could use, just for example?
Yeah, so on Motherwell, very quickly, I think what they've done well is I've been lucky to speak to someone from Motherwell recently and understand the process a bit better, but what they've done is very much not just on a surface level lent into it through branding, but through action, right? They're very boots on the ground, flyering, handing out leaflets in the local community. They live by those values, and that's absolutely essential, because if you don't, you become Caledonian Braves. You become a branding exercise. The people that do their social media are very good at making things look good. The way they promoted the club and told the story was very algorithm friendly. To me, they come across as, and I doubt they are, I bet there's a lot of passion there, but they come across as soulless, corporate, and not representative at all of people or place. Because Caledonian, what does that mean? Braves, how Americanized is that? Nothing wrong with American culture, as I said. I think they're the best at this. But you need to understand the cultural nuances and inflections of place, and implanting a model does not work, period. You just can't do that. You couldn't take the sort of Portuguese model of doing things with a president and the way they engage with ultras, etc., or Italian model, and bring that to the UK. It's just a different model. So with Caledonian Braves, I mean, burn it and start from the ground up. Honestly, I think it would be great to hear from the local people and think, what do you care about? What matters to you? I remember, man, this is an example you might end up having to cut this, but I remember years ago, do you remember this hysteria around Eminem and Marilyn Manson? That shooting and any crazy shit that happened in the States got blamed on them, right? It was that's Eminem's influence, that's Marilyn Manson's influence. I remember there was an interview with him post-Columbine when the tragedy that happened at the high school there, and they said, what would you say to these people who want an answer from you? What would you say to the kids? And he's like, I wouldn't say anything, I would listen, and that's what you never done. And I thought, shit, that was ultimate mic drop, because that's so true. And that's what people don't do. Maybe Caledonian Braves is a great representation of the local people. I doubt it is, because I'm Scottish and I don't get it. And I think that's where I would start, from the ground up. I would think, okay, what's the place like? What did they have? What was the industry that was here? Who are some remarkable figures from this place? What are some cultural figures? What's the landscape like? As a result, what are the people like? And how did people shape that? Are they all, is it very local and native populations, or is there a large sort of immigrant population? What's the demographics like here? What do people want here? And then I would build that from the very start. I think I would try to create something that ultimately represents the values of the place better, and I think you get better buy-in. But then again, their target audience isn't local, clearly. Their target audience is Americans, and they're selling Scottishness in a twee manner that's probably quite like Brigadoon, that 1950s film when it was just people dancing around huts and kilts. Mud huts almost, shacks, as if that was Scottishness, and that was the height of Scottish culture. That's how it feels to me. It feels it's quite tokenistic, Caledonian Braves, as if all the fans rock up like claymores and kilts, and that's where they're going wrong. I think that's not how football works, certainly not in the UK. You need to look at what's in your immediate vicinity first. Build your local identity, and let's be honest, local sells better globally anyway. You go to I lived in Lisbon for 3 years. At the start, I felt I learned Portuguese, not to a high standard, but enough. My mum visited about 5 times over those 3 years. At the start, I taught her the bit hello, thank you, etc. And by the end, on the last trip, she's like, I've never had to say any of these words, by the way. And I thought, yeah, of course not, because even in that 3-year period, it's become such an international place that, I mean, I've got close friends from there. They've literally been pushed out of Lisbon to extreme suburbs because they can't afford to live in the place. That now is a less attractive brand of a place to go to, unless you're just one of these sort of Instagrammer people who wants to show everything on whatever. But that doesn't sell as well as it would if it felt like Portuguese and it felt like Lisbon. It's a different thing now. And I think that's what clubs need to understand, is that if you get your local model right, people will buy into that. When I lived in Dublin, Bows Games always had people from overseas there. Why? Because they thought, this is the club of North Dublin. This is the working class associations. Bows are another great example, by the way, of a consistently well-branded brand, ultimately.
Totally.
Dan, who leads that up, I don't know if he still has, but he had a cafe just round the corner that was almost like a hub, a genuine place, not just a tokenistic kind of spot. That was a real part of the community. They hosted events, they had flyers and posters everywhere. It was like a true representation in North Dublin culture. And because he's, I think, a director at the club, they emanate that same aura, and that is their target audience. But because of that, they're now more globally appealing. Whereas if they had went for the global appeal, fans who came over to Dublin, they wanted to experience Dublin, they would go somewhere else. So that's how I would see, if you go to that area, you're going to look at Motherwell and think, shit, that's real Scottish football, because they're doing it right. Caledonian Braves, I don't know anyone who would come over who knew a thing about football would think, I want to experience Scotland, I'm going to see a Caledonian Braves game. It's like, you just wouldn't. It's a sentence you'll never hear. And that's not to take shots at them, because I'm sure they're doing it with good intentions, but it's just not for me.
It's kind of the same, like you said, marketing exercise there, or branding exercise, and it was kind of the same as Open Goal Broomhill from a few years back as well. Incredibly short-lived, I think, for maybe 5-6 months, if that. But again, Broomhill at that point had already split with another club because they'd moved away from Broomhill, and now, they're really, really struggling at the moment despite that having ended. And it's because people have noticed that these guys are actually a bit of a mess, and they're not actually appreciating what our identity is, or our culture, or our place, or where our clubs come from. And that goes a really long way as well. And I think we've touched on it throughout the episode, and it's been a really, really great chat, Ed. So thank you very much for joining me. But obviously, heritage is vitally important to club identities, and then how they end up branding and market themselves as well. And heritage can be everything from the place the clubs come from, its fans, where the founders have come from, what the club does, what its outlook is, and ultimately what its social media and brand presence is as well. And is there anything else you'd like to add just before we finish up for today?
Yeah, so I think in terms of how heritage plays a part in what a club is, I guess the way I see football is on a sort of reverse bell curve. So when football clubs started, they had a purpose and they had a goal. So if you look at Hibs, they started with from a church in the Cowgate to get young guys away from drinking and fighting and doing what people done at that time in a highly impoverished area. Yeah. They went around Scotland, they'd done a great amount of charity work, raised a lot of money in a lot of different communities by playing football. So that was football as a vehicle for social change, for social good. And this is just one such example. I'm not saying Hibs have lost their way, I'm saying clubs started with a purpose, right? Yeah. Almost all clubs, even if it was just a way for the workforce to congregate outside of work, there was a purpose. Then obviously football grew and grew and grew, became sort of commercialised through broadcasting deals. I think players' unions trying to do right by the players ultimately destroyed many aspects of the game by opening the floodgates for a system whereby money is ultimately the ultimate decider. And some people believe football is more than that. And I think I'm one of those people. But clubs lost a purpose and identity over a vast period of time because they didn't really, I think they had to manage it or understand that it was important to. But that bell curve now, the reverse bell curve, for the listeners, is sort of like peaking again, and clubs are realising, okay, so we do need to understand our purpose and who we are. So I think your heritage is one such part of that. Your reason for starting is a good place to start when you're understanding what your identity is. Okay, so who are we? Even if your club is, in Scotland, it's generally 100 years at least. Hibs 150 next year. Hearts just turned 150. It's what did we start to, what was our goal ultimately, what was our purpose? And I think your heritage is, it's the strip you wear, which are all reflections of why you started. But that's so key to who you are today, is understanding the sort of the environment from where you came, the people that made your club, because ultimately that's how you got to where you are today. Even if many clubs, majority of clubs, in many ways have lost their way, I think you just need to understand where you came from to understand what your identity is. And I think heritage is just, you can't separate that from brand, and you absolutely need to lean into that as you move forward in the future. Not just your heritage, so that's just a part of your story. Everything else that happened in between, from your formative years when you had that purpose, that's still a part of your brand and your identity. Like Charlton Athletic, they're known for their sort of like pretty good academy, one of the best in England consistently, and the biggest community trust in the whole of England. But for like street footballers, guys from like London,
of course,
London that had that rough and ready willingness to get stuck in. That's who they are. They're a part of their identity anyway. So that's kind of Charlton heritage, but very contemporary heritage, not necessarily their foundational heritage. So it's not just about the very beginning, but that's always the place to start. And then I think it's just sort of tracing the club's trajectory over the years, understanding how and why things changed, and picking out, I suppose, key moments, key things that ultimately resonate with fans, because that's the purpose in doing all this. Get an engaged fan base, and an engaged fan base are people who will turn up to games, who will buy tickets, not just because you've sold them some kind of slippery marketing tricks, because you're speaking their language and they think, okay, this is a club that represents me. That's why Sporting Lisbon fans will bring flares to basketball games, even though the majority of them are football fans. I trained with their, or certainly guys who were in their boxing and kickboxing teams, and they were Sporting Lisbon through and through. Some of them were football fans, some weren't. Some were just fighters, right? But as in professional. But they were Sporting Lisbon through and through. That's what represented them, because that was a part of their identity. So heritage is, not just your history, it's everything you inherit by definition up to the present day. And then again, it's how you use that to build something resilient and robust for the future.
Yeah, you're spot on. I completely agree with you. I mean, again, just to add quickly, just before we finish up, it's one of the clubs that in Scotland anyway that I don't want to say worried about. That's maybe a bit extreme, but are on a really kind of downward trajectory right now is St Johnstone. I mean, this is a club 3 years ago who won a cup double. Do you know what I mean? Now they're in they've had financial difficulties. They're in danger of being relegated. They've been flirting with relegation the last few seasons. Their attendances are dropping despite the fact that they're one of these provincial teams. They're not a million miles away from Dundee, don't get me wrong, but Perth has always had a pretty strong identity separate to that of Dundee's. But I heard someone describe them to me quite recently as a boring club, and I think that it's a shame for them to be described as that, but I don't think it's wrong. They're not really doing anything to get fans along, and they're almost kind of banking on the fact that we're the only club for 10, 20 miles around, so people will come and see us regardless. It's not worked out for them. Do you know what I mean? So they need to try and find these things to delve into to try and get people back in, and I think that's just one of many examples that we could probably touch on. But as I said, Ed, this has been something a bit different for us today, but it's been a really, really great episode, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well. If you want to check out Ed and the rest of his work, we'll put links to all of his accounts in the show notes below. He's one of the co-founders of the Deep Creative, who help football clubs really tap into their heritage and improve their brand and identities and social media output. Of course, if there's anything that you want to get in touch with us about, you can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. So please get in touch. We're happy to discuss anything related to football history and heritage. So get in touch, have a chat with us, and we'll see what we can do to get you on the show. But for now, Ed, say goodbye.
Thank you for your time, and thank you to anyone who listens. And hopefully some people hear it and think, I get heritage now. I get the part it plays in identity. I'm excited. That's what matters.
Yeah, that's my hope as well. That's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.